Part 5, The Metropolic Manifest and Pure Pop Hegemony, 2013 to 2016. Chapter 41, The New York Re-Education and Tribeca Sanctuary. The boxes arrived before she did. 43 of them, stacked in the freight elevator of a Tribeca penthouse that looked out over a city that had never once asked for her permission to be extraordinary. The movers worked fast, the way movers do in New York, indifferent to the historic weight of what they were carrying. Guitar cases leaned against raw concrete pillars, sequined stage costumes sealed in garment bags that scraped the hardwood, a framed watercolor of a tree from her Nashville childhood bubble-wrapped and wedged beside a flat-screen television still in its box. Taylor Swift stood in the middle of all of it on a Thursday morning in the autumn of 2013, 23 years old, wearing no makeup, her hair pulled back in a knot that had slipped loose on one side, and she did not unpack a single thing. She walked instead to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the Hudson, at the haze of the financial district beyond, at the water towers that jutted from the rooftops like old sentinels who had seen every version of every ambition that had ever arrived in this city by train or tunnel or sheer force of nerve. She stood there for a long time. Then she picked up her notebook from the top of the nearest box and began to write. That image, the unpacked life, the open notebook the city spread below like an unwritten page, would come to define everything that followed. Nashville had made her. It had given her the steel-string grammar of her first confessions, the rolling green metaphors of small-town longing, the cosmology of pickup trucks and bleachers and boys who never quite deserved the songs she wrote about them. For 6 years, she had lived inside that grammar so fluently that it had become invisible to her, the way a native language does. But by late 2013, Taylor Swift had begun to hear something Nashville could not teach her: a harder rhythm, a colder light, a new syntax of selfhood that had nothing to do with front porches or Friday night football. The songs she needed to write next didn't live in the Tennessee hills. They lived in taxicabs at 2 a.m, in the electric anonymity of a crowd on a sidewalk, in the specific silence of a high-ceilinged room in a city that would not romanticize you simply because you asked it to. So she moved. The decision was not, by any measure, impulsive. Swift had been circling New York for years, keeping an apartment on the Upper East Side as a secondary residence, sampling the city the way careful people sample everything, in small, deliberate doses before committing. But the move to Tribeca in the fall of 2013 was something different. It was not a satellite residence. It was a declaration. The neighborhood itself carried meaning. Tribeca in that era was the domain of artists and financiers who had outgrown their need to announce themselves. A neighborhood of cast-iron facades and cobblestone streets where privacy was the ultimate luxury and where the prevailing aesthetic was raw, industrial, understated, expensive. It was not the New York of celebrity sightings and tourist itineraries. It was the New York of people who had arrived and were no longer interested in being seen arriving. The cultural climate into which she stepped was, in certain respects, the most inhospitable terrain a country artist could choose. The early 2010s had produced a particular strain of critical snobbery toward mainstream pop, a reflexive suspicion, rooted partly in the legacy of indie rock gatekeeping and partly in a genuine cultural fatigue with the processed, algorithm-smoothed product that dominated radio. Pitchfork culture still held enormous sway over the taste-making apparatus of American music journalism, and that culture had never been especially generous to Taylor Swift. She was too successful to be interesting, too polished to be dangerous, too country to be cool, and too pop to be taken seriously as either. She existed in a critical no-man's land that was, paradoxically, the most commercially inhabited territory on Earth. Her albums sold in numbers that bordered on the geological. Her critical standing was another matter entirely. New York did not resolve that contradiction, but it gave her the materials to render it irrelevant. The core conflict of this chapter, and of Swift's life in this particular window, was not the usual battle of ambition against circumstance. It was something more interior and more dangerous, the problem of self-invention under conditions of total public saturation. By late 2013, Taylor Swift was not simply famous. She was a phenomenon of such scale that her personal life had become a genre unto itself, dissected in real time by millions of observers who felt entitled to opinions about her relationships, her friendships, her weight, her hair, her choices, and her motives. The move to New York was partly an artistic reset and partly a survival strategy, a way of stepping into a city large enough to absorb her, to render her, at least in theory, merely another person moving through a crowd rather than the fixed center of a cultural solar system. The irony was that New York, rather than diminishing her celebrity, would amplify it to a frequency that no one, including Swift herself, had yet imagined possible. But in those first months, before the amplification began, there was something that resembled freedom. She walked. This is not a small detail. Swift was, by the accounts of those close to her during this period, a person who had spent years moving between hermetically sealed environments, tour buses, arenas, green rooms, private cars, gated properties, rarely experiencing the texture of public space at walking pace. New York cracked that sealed world open. She walked the High Line in the early morning before the tourists arrived, walked the length of the West Village without a destination, walked through the meatpacking district at night when the crowd was thick enough to swallow her whole. She wore baseball caps and oversized coats. She was spotted anyway, of course. She was always spotted, but the city's fundamental indifference gave those encounters a different quality. New Yorkers, unlike the carefully managed audiences of a stadium tour, were simply too busy to perform their recognition of her for very long. They looked. They recognized. They moved on. For a woman who had spent the better part of a decade as the fixed object of concentrated public attention, that casual dismissal was a form of oxygen. It was in this city, walking these streets, that she began to hear the architecture of what would become 1989. The album that emerged from this period, released in October 2014 and named for the year of her birth, would represent the most decisive artistic pivot of her career to that point. It was, deliberately and completely, a pop record. Not a country pop record with crossover ambitions, not a hybrid that kept one boot in the genre of her origins, but a clean-lined, synthesizer-lit, maximally confident declaration of pop sovereignty. The production was handled largely by Max Martin and Shellback, the Swedish hit-making apparatus responsible for much of the defining pop architecture of the previous 2 decades, with additional contributions from Jack Antonoff, the New Jersey-raised rock musician who would become one of Swift's most enduring creative collaborators. The sonic palette was unmistakably of the moment. Gated drum reverbs that recalled the 1980s by way of the 2010s, layered vocal harmonies that traded country warmth for something more crystalline and controlled, synthesizer lines that shimmered rather than twanged. But the writing beneath that palette was entirely, recognizably Swift, precise, anecdotal, emotionally surgical, organized around the specific detail rather than the general sentiment. The keyhole moment, the single anecdote that most clearly illuminates the interior logic of this period, came not in a studio or on a stage, but in a conference room at the offices of Big Machine Records in Nashville, some months before the album's release. Swift had called a meeting with her label and her management team to announce that she intended to release 1989 without country radio support, without the Nashville promotional apparatus that had delivered her first 4 albums to their audiences, and without the genre designation that had defined her since she was 15 years old. The room, by the recollections of those present, went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone has said something that cannot be unsaid. The commercial risk was not theoretical. Country radio in 2014 was still a potent commercial engine, and the audience that had made Taylor Swift a millionaire many times over was an audience that had found her on country stations and identified her, however complicated that identification had become, as a country artist. She was proposing to tell that audience, in the most public possible way, that she was leaving. What struck those present was not the boldness of the decision. They had all learned by that point to expect boldness from her, but the quality of her certainty. She did not present the pivot as a gamble. She presented it as a conclusion, as the inevitable endpoint of a process of artistic reasoning that she had already completed privately and was now simply reporting to the room. She had made the album she had made because it was the album that was true, and the album that was true was a pop album, and therefore she was a pop artist now, and that was that. The directness of it, the refusal to perform ambivalence, to soften the announcement with qualifications or strategic hedging, was, in miniature, the defining quality of the artist she was becoming in New York, someone who had decided that the performance of uncertainty was a luxury she could no longer afford. The relationship that anchored this chapter, and that would shape the entire 1989 era in ways both practical and symbolic, was the one she was building with Lorde. The New Zealand singer-songwriter, born Ella Yelich O'Connor, was 17 years old in 2013, 4 years younger than Swift, and had just released Pure Heroine, an album of spare, confessional pop that had been received with the kind of critical enthusiasm that Swift's work rarely generated. Where Swift was maximalist, Lorde was minimalist. Where Swift was unambiguously commercial, Lorde occupied that prized critical space of commercial success, arrived at through apparent artistic refusal. They were, on paper, improbable companions. What they shared in practice was something more useful than aesthetic similarity. They were both young women who had achieved extraordinary levels of public scrutiny before they had finished becoming who they were going to be, and they had both developed, in response to that scrutiny, an unusually sophisticated consciousness about the machinery of image-making and the ways it could be used rather than merely endured. Their friendship, which solidified during this period through the specific intimacy of shared industry experience and late-night conversation, represented something new in Swift's relational constellation. She had always been close to her female friends. The loyalty was genuine and documented, but those friendships had tended to run along lines of warmth and mutual support, the emotional architecture of a person who had grown up in the Southern tradition of fierce female solidarity. Lorde offered something different, an intellectual companionship, a peer relationship between two people who were genuinely equal in their understanding of what was being done to them by the world and in their determination to do something back. In the years that followed as the Squad, Swift's expanding public circle of famous female friends became itself a cultural phenomenon and eventually a target of cultural backlash. The Lorde friendship would quietly persist as the most substantive of her peer relationships, private, mutual, occasionally tense, and productively honest in the way that friendships between people who respect each other's intelligence tend to be. By the time 1989 was released in October 2014 and sold 1.287 million copies in its first week, the largest opening sales week for any album in more than a decade, the re-education that New York had provided was already complete. Swift had absorbed the city's lessons about reinvention, anonymity, and the productive uses of self-invention, had metabolized them into the most commercially successful album of her career, and had done all of it before most of the people who would debate its cultural significance had finished reading the reviews. But no one in that Tribeca apartment, looking out at the Hudson on that autumn morning in 2013, could have seen, not Swift herself, not the city below, not the industry that would shortly congratulate itself for her success, was the machinery already turning beneath the surface of her triumph, the accumulating resentments, the manufactured rivalries, the structural misogyny of an industry that had supported her commercial ascent while withholding the one currency she had never fully been granted, and the approaching collision between the artist she had become and the ownership of the music that had made her. The penthouse, when she finally unpacked it, was everything she had imagined. The view was extraordinary. The walls, as she would later come to understand, had windows in all directions. Chapter 42. Recording 1989, The Jack Antonoff Alliance. The studio smelled like cold coffee and ambition. It was somewhere deep in the architecture of a Manhattan recording session. Late afternoon light gone flat against the windows, synthesizer cables snaking across the floor like the circuitry of a new nervous system. And Taylor Swift was standing at a whiteboard with a marker in her hand, drawing boxes. Not musical notation. Boxes. Each one labeled with a single word, feeling. She had been doing this for weeks, arriving early to sessions with a legal pad already covered in observations. Not metaphors yet, not lyrics yet, but raw phenomenology, the taxonomy of her own emotional life rendered in ballpoint pen. She was 24 years old, and she was trying, with the systematic intensity of a scientist and the desperation of an artist, to build the architecture of a sound she hadn't yet heard, but could already feel pressing against the inside of her chest like something that needed to be born. Jack Antonoff arrived carrying a laptop and a breakfast sandwich, which he set on the edge of a console without ceremony, the way a man arrives at a place he already considers home. He had been part of Fun when they charted with We Are Young, a song that had briefly colonized the cultural atmosphere so completely that its absence felt like a drop in barometric pressure. But that version of Antonoff, the rock-leaning collaborator, the indie credential, was precisely not what Taylor needed. What she needed was the version of him that sat alone with synthesizers at night, the version that heard emotion in texture rather than melody, the version that could translate the distance between two people into a specific frequency. That version, it turned out, was the same man. He sat down, opened the laptop, and played her a loop he had been building for 3 days. She listened with her eyes closed. When it stopped, she said, "That's the loneliness of being in a crowd." Antonoff looked up. That was exactly what he had been trying to make. The cultural moment into which the recording sessions for 1989 were inserted was a peculiar one for an artist of Taylor Swift's stature and temperament. Pop music in 2013 had entered a phase of studied maximalism. Trap hi-hats threaded through everything, EDM drops were colonizing the charts, and the dominant aesthetic logic of commercial radio seemed to be volume as a form of sincerity. Vulnerability, when it appeared at all, tended to arrive wrapped in spectacle. Meanwhile, the critical establishment had spent the better part of 5 years performing elaborate exercises in ambivalence about Taylor Swift, acknowledging her commercial dominance while hedging on artistic credibility, as though the two could not coexist in the same body. The country establishment, from which she had emerged and which had sustained her earliest years, watched her gravitational drift toward pure pop with the mixture of pride and betrayal that attaches to any defection. She was too big to ignore and, for some, too calculated to fully embrace. She occupied, in other words, the peculiar loneliness of the extremely visible, everywhere and somehow still misread. Into this landscape, she was proposing something that ran against nearly every prevailing current. No banjos. No twang, even residual. And no capitulation to the noise politics of contemporary radio. What she wanted, what she had been listening toward for months, combing through the production catalog of the 1980s with an archivist's patience, was clarity. Spaces between sounds. The emotional intelligence of restraint. She had been listening to Peter Gabriel and Kate Bush, and the way the synthesizers on those records created something that felt simultaneously like memory and premonition, and she wanted that feeling, that specific texture of yearning rendered in clean harmonic architecture. The problem was that wanting it and being able to build it were entirely different propositions, and she knew the difference. The core conflict inside the 1989 sessions was not, as the later narrative would sometimes suggest, simply a question of genre reinvention. The reinvention was the surface, the conflict ran deeper. Taylor Swift was attempting to do something that almost no artist at her level of commercial saturation had successfully accomplished. She was trying to make a record that was simultaneously more personal and more artistically ambitious than anything she had made before, while also being legible to an audience of tens of millions who had very specific expectations about what a Taylor Swift record meant. The intimacy she was reaching for, the microscopic emotional precision, the specificity of the lyrical observations she was pressing into shapes, required a vulnerability that scale tends to crush. Arena pop and chamber confession are not, as a rule, compatible. She was trying to make them compatible. Every session carried this tension. The moment a lyric got too strange, too specific, too interior, someone in the room would wonder whether it would translate. And Taylor would keep it anyway, or revise it toward specificity rather than away from it, or argue for it with the kind of patient certainty that is either confidence or stubbornness, depending on whether you're the one arguing or the one being argued with. The session that produced Out of the Woods has been recounted in fragments across various interviews, but its internal logic has rarely been fully rendered. Antonoff had built the track's instrumental first, a cascading synth structure that kept returning to the same urgent, unresolved phrase, a musical equivalent of a repeated anxiety, something that turned over and over without landing. When Taylor heard it, she sat with the loop for a long time before she spoke. She had been thinking about a relationship she had been in during the Red Era, a period of such emotional turbulence that even the recollection of it felt, she said, like being inside weather. She wanted to write something that captured not the events of that relationship, but the texture of anxiety inside it, the constant question, the way fear could become its own environment. She told Antonoff, "I want the song to feel like a panic attack that turns into relief." They spent 4 days building it, tearing it down, rebuilding. At one point, she sat on the floor of the studio with a legal pad and worked through the bridge by herself for an hour while Antonoff, understanding instinctively that this was not a moment to collaborate, produced quietly in the corner without speaking. The bridge that emerged, its cascading, almost liturgical repetition of a single question, was not what either of them had planned. It was what the song needed, which is a different thing entirely, and both of them knew the difference. Max Martin entered the sessions as a third intelligence, and the dynamic that emerged between the three of them was architecturally specific. Antonoff provided emotional texture and creative latitude. Taylor provided vision and lyrical precision, and Martin provided the formal geometry that kept everything from dissolving into feeling. Martin had spent 30 years building hit records through an almost mathematical understanding of how melody and rhythm create expectation and release in the human nervous system. And he brought this understanding to the 1989 sessions not as a corrective, but as a structural principle. Where Antonoff and Taylor might circle a moment, layering and relayering, Martin would identify the load-bearing wall, the single melodic or harmonic decision that everything else was orbiting, and insist on its clarity. The creative argument that arose most frequently, according to those present, was between texture and legibility. Taylor and Antonoff wanted the emotional complexity to live in the production itself, in the spaces and reverbs and the way sounds decayed, and Martin kept pulling them back toward the melodic surface, toward the hook. The record that emerged from this negotiation was not a compromise, but a synthesis, which is rarer and harder. The emotional depth lives in the production exactly as Taylor and Antonoff intended, but it is organized around melodic structures so formally clean that the complexity becomes audible only on repeated listening. The first time, you catch the melody. The fifth time, you hear what's underneath it. Jack Antonoff's presence in these sessions was, in the most precise sense, enabling, but not in the way the word is sometimes used to suggest permission or indulgence. What he enabled was the particular kind of trust that creative risk requires, the knowledge that the person across from you is both skilled enough and honest enough to catch you if the risk collapses. Taylor had always worked with collaborators, but the partnerships that preceded 1989, particularly with Nathan Chapman during the country years, had been rooted in a shared idiom, a common musical language. Antonoff represented something different, a creative mind that operated from entirely different instincts and references, someone who would sometimes hear a Taylor Swift lyric and respond not with a production suggestion but with a question, "What does that actually feel like in your body?" and wait for the answer. She found in these exchanges that she had to articulate things she had previously left at the level of instinct. The discipline of that articulation shaped the record in ways that neither of them fully anticipated. Songs became more architecturally coherent because the emotional logic had been examined and named rather than simply followed. The albums celebrated consistency of tone, the thing that critics would eventually reach for when they tried to explain why 1989 felt unified rather than merely collected, was partly a function of this process, the insistence on saying what the feeling was before building the sound around it. By the time the sessions were approaching completion, Taylor had become something she had never quite been before in a recording context: the primary creative authority over a sonic identity that had no precedent in her own catalog. Every previous record, however much she had written or shaped, had existed in relationship to an established Taylor Swift sound: the country girl with the curly hair and the storyteller's instincts, then the crossover artist pushing towards something larger. 1989 had no such anchor. It was, in the most literal sense, a leap, made from a position of enough commercial power that the leap could be absorbed if it failed commercially, but not enough artistic credibility in certain critical quarters to guarantee a soft landing if it failed aesthetically. She knew this. The knowledge didn't paralyze her. If anything, it sharpened the focus of the final sessions, the way the awareness of a deadline sharpens attention, but it was present in the room, a kind of productive pressure that Antonoff and Martin both recognized and neither named aloud, because naming it would have changed its character. The final tracking session for what would become the album's lead single was finished on a Thursday evening, and Taylor listened to the playback 3 times without speaking, the way she sometimes did when something had landed where she intended it. The third time, she turned to Antonoff and said something that those present would describe differently in subsequent years: the precise words contested, the emotional register unanimous. The gist of it was simple: "I think this is the one." Not the single. The whole album. She thought they had made the thing she had been trying to make. Antonoff, who tends toward the laconic in moments of actual feeling, nodded once. Martin, who had seen a great many albums completed from the inside, reached for his coffee. Outside, Manhattan was doing what Manhattan does at dusk. Its thousand simultaneous urgencies compressing into a single, low roar that comes up through the floor of any building old enough to have absorbed it. And the record that would spend 11 weeks at number 1, that would sell more than 10 million copies, that would be certified diamond and become one of the defining commercial and artistic statements of its decade, was finished. What none of them could see in that room on that Thursday evening, with the playback still warm in the air and the satisfactions of completion still unexamined, what the record's imminent success would conceal even from Taylor herself, at least for a time, was that the very magnitude of what 1989 was about to accomplish would create a kind of gravitational event, pulling toward her not just admiration and cultural centrality, but also exposure, scrutiny, and the particular hostility that attaches in American public life to women who become too large to contain within any single narrative, and that the apparatus of celebrity and reputation management she was quietly assembling around herself, the friendships and the branding and the careful architecture of her public self, would soon face a pressure for which no studio session, however honest, however precise, however architecturally brilliant, could have prepared her. Chapter 43. Blank Space and Satirical Self-Ownership. The conference room at Big Machine Records smelled of cold coffee and printer ink, and Taylor Swift sat very still at one end of the table, a legal pad in front of her filled with a single column of words. Not lyrics, exactly. More like weapons. She had been cataloging them for months, every adjective the tabloids had assigned her, every epithet the gossip cycle had sharpened into a blade and driven between her ribs. Crazy. Calculating. Collected. Cold. She read them back in silence, her pen moving in slow, deliberate circles around the ones that stung the most, and then she did something that almost no one in the room anticipated. She smiled. Not the practiced smile of a press junket. Something narrower. Something that belonged entirely to her. What if, she said, setting the pen down flat, we just made her real? The question hung over the table. Her collaborator Jack Antonoff would later describe the weeks that followed as some of the most conceptually charged sessions of his career. Not because the music was technically difficult, but because the intention behind it was so precisely calibrated that every word had to carry double weight. Taylor Swift, who had spent the better part of 3 years being characterized as the architect of her own romantic disasters, had decided to stop defending herself. She had decided instead to confess, to amplify, to build the monster from the inside and hand the audience the remote control. This was the conceptual engine behind Blank Space, and it would become the most watched music video in YouTube history within weeks of its release. The cultural atmosphere of late 2013 and 2014 was, for women in pop music, something close to a pressure system without a release valve. The internet had matured just enough to be dangerous, algorithmically accelerating outrage, rewarding the most reductive takes, flattening complexity into a single scroll-stopping frame. Female artists were being sorted into archetypes with an almost industrial efficiency: the provocateur, the ingenue, the cautionary tale. Taylor Swift had been assigned the last category with a kind of glee that reflected less about her than about the culture's discomfort with a young woman who was simultaneously commercially dominant, romantically visible, and unapologetically self-authored. Each new relationship was charted like a financial liability. Each breakup became content. The media apparatus, which had celebrated her early country sincerity, had rotated on its axis and decided that her sincerity was now the problem. Evidence of manipulation, of strategic vulnerability, of a fame machine wearing a flannel shirt. She had moved to New York City by then, to a Tribeca apartment with high ceilings and a view of rooftops she would later describe as feeling, finally, anonymous in a way she had never been allowed to be in Nashville. The city did not care about her in the way Nashville cared, which is to say it did not require anything of her except that she keep moving. She walked the streets in the early mornings before the day organized itself around recognition, and she watched the city generate its own stories, indifferent and enormous, and she began to understand something about scale. Nashville had built her. New York, she was beginning to suspect, might rebuild her differently. The 1989 album, named for the year of her birth and conceived as a clean break from the country infrastructure that had housed her for nearly a decade, was already taking shape in the studios where she worked with Antonoff and with the Swedish producer Max Martin, who had spent 30 years mapping the geometry of the perfect pop song. But the specific challenge of Blank Space was something Taylor Swift owned alone. The song required her to write in a voice she had never inhabited publicly, the voice of the woman the press had decided she was. Mercurial, predatory, serially heartbroken, and serially heartbreaking. A woman who collected men like trophies and discarded them like drafts. The core conflict was not melodic or even lyrical in the narrow sense. It was authorial. To write from inside the caricature was to risk becoming it, to give critics the ammunition they had been loading the chamber with for years. Every line of Blank Space could be clipped, decontextualized, stripped of its ironic architecture and presented as evidence. Darling, I'm a nightmare dressed like a daydream. Written straight, that lyric was a confession. Written with the precision Taylor Swift brought to it. The sweetness in the voice, the lushness of the production, the video's gleaming satirical excess, it became something else entirely. It became a mirror held up to the people doing the narrating. The irony was structural, not decorative. This was the distinction that separated Blank Space from a simple, self-deprecating pop song. And it was the distinction that most of the initial critical response missed or minimized. Taylor Swift was not apologizing. She was not performing contrition in the guise of self-awareness. She was staging a prosecution of the media's own image of her with herself as both the defendant and the attorney. And she was doing it in a song so melodically irresistible that it would be played in supermarkets and at high school dances and through the earbuds of 13-year-olds who had never read a single tabloid headline about her romantic history. The mechanism was the reveal. Most pop songs about romantic dysfunction, and there had been many from many artists across many decades, positioned the narrator as the wounded party. The injury was the story. Blank Space inverted this completely. The narrator is the wound giver. She is fully cognizant of her own destructive potential, announces it in the opening verse, and offers it as a feature rather than a flaw. See you in the dark. All eyes on you, my magician. The listener is being recruited, not warned. This was a radical repositioning. Taylor Swift had taken the accusation, "You are dangerous, you are calculating, you leave ruin in your wake," and converted it into something seductive and controlled and darkly funny, and she had done it with a production aesthetic so clean and bright that the darkness inside it arrived like a sleight of hand. The music video, directed by Joseph Kahn, extended the satire into visual language. A sprawling English manor. Elaborate gowns. A rotating cast of beautiful men. Jealousy performed as grand opera. Taylor Swift playing the jealous lover with such operatic commitment that the performance announced itself as performance, which was precisely the point. She was not hiding the artificiality. She was foregrounding it. The Taylor Swift the tabloids had constructed was a fictional character, and she was going to play that character with full technical commitment and let the audience decide what they were watching. It was a move that required an almost clinical self-awareness, and it was made possible in part by her collaboration with Antonoff, whose own sensibility ran toward the emotionally precise and the structurally unconventional. Jack Antonoff had built his production reputation on a capacity to hold complexity without resolving it, to write music that sounded like a memory of something that hadn't happened yet. What he brought to Blank Space, and to the broader 1989 project, was a willingness to take Taylor Swift's conceptual instincts seriously as instincts rather than commercial calculations. When she described what she wanted the song to feel like, not just sound like, feel like, he understood that she was working in a register that pop production rarely visited. She wanted the listener to feel implicated, to laugh and then stop laughing, and not be entirely sure why. Their working relationship during this period was less about creative opposition and more about creative amplification. Antonoff would later describe Taylor Swift's instincts in the studio as operating faster than the language available to describe them. She knew what was wrong with a line before she could fully articulate why, and she trusted that knowledge with a conviction that was sometimes difficult to keep pace with. For a young woman who had spent years having her instincts second-guessed by a media apparatus that could not decide whether she was too deliberate or too emotional, the recording studio had become the one space where her own judgment was not subject to appeal. The 1989 era also marked a significant shift in her relationship with her own fame, and that shift had a texture that was visible in real time to the people around her. She had begun to understand stardom not as a condition to be managed but as a material, something that could be worked, shaped, used. The decision to move to New York was part of this recalibration. Nashville was where she had been formed. New York was where she could observe herself from the outside, could see the shape of the public Taylor Swift against the grid of a city that had swallowed larger myths than hers and not blinked. She was photographed constantly in those first New York months, at the corner coffee shop, leaving late-night recording sessions in the back of cabs, and the images circulated through the machinery of celebrity coverage with a different charge than the Nashville photographs had carried. In Nashville, she had looked rooted. In New York, she looked in motion. The city gave her velocity, and velocity was something she had decided she needed. Stillness, she had learned, invited the narrative to settle around you like sediment. Her friendships during this period were also shifting in ways that would later become a subject of considerable cultural commentary. The group of women she drew around her, musicians, models, actresses, athletes, represented a kind of public articulation of female solidarity that was both genuine and inevitably interpreted. Some observers saw the friendships as calculated tabloid counterprogramming. Others understood them as something simpler. A young woman who had spent years being pitted against other women by headlines and gossip columns and the general competitive logic of the entertainment industry, deciding deliberately to construct an alternative grammar. She was not going to be defined by who she had dated. She was going to be visible instead, in relationship to who she admired. This was in its own way as strategic as blank space. Not because the friendships were false, by all available evidence they were not, but because Taylor Swift had understood that the images people carried of her were going to be constructed from whatever materials were available, and she had decided to be the primary supplier of those materials. Control the image. Control the story. Not through suppression or denial, which had never worked for anyone, but through generation. Produce so much counter-narrative that the original story loses its gravity. Blank Space debuted at number 1. The video broke records. The critical conversation, slowly and then all at once, shifted from the premise that Taylor Swift was the subject of her own mythology to the recognition that she was in fact its author. This was not a minor distinction. It was the entire argument. And yet, even as the song climbed, and the album shipped, and the 1989 World Tour began its 18-month global circuit, selling out stadiums on 6 continents, generating gross revenues that placed it among the highest-earning concert tours in history, something was assembling itself just beyond the edge of the frame. The same mechanisms that had allowed Taylor Swift to reclaim her narrative were also quietly building the conditions for a new kind of attack. The internet that had helped amplify her satire was beginning to generate its own counter-mythology, one that the irony of blank space would prove in the end no defense against. She had learned to use the media as a mirror. She had not yet reckoned with what happens when the mirror is held by someone else. Point 2. Chapter 44. The Apple Music Open Letter and Streaming Power. The cursor blinked in the white silence of her Tribeca apartment, and Taylor Swift sat with her laptop balanced on her knees in the early hours of a June morning in 2015, reading back what she had written. Not a lyric. Not a bridge. Not a verse, constructed with the precision of someone who had spent half her life learning to say in 3 minutes what most people couldn't say in 3 hours. This was something else, a letter addressed to one of the most powerful corporations on the planet, written in her own name, under her own authority, asking a simple and devastating question: why are you doing this to us? She read the opening lines again. She had written them the way she wrote everything that mattered, in one long exhale, the argument arriving whole before she had time to second-guess it. She knew what she was about to do. She knew that the music press would dissect it, that Twitter would ignite, that Apple's communications team would be jolted awake by their phones before dawn. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was how completely the next 72 hours would redefine the frontier of what a single artist could do when she decided to stop asking permission. It was the summer of 2015, and the music industry was, by almost any honest accounting, in a condition of managed crisis. Streaming had ceased to be a novelty or a threat, and had become the dominant grammar of how music was consumed. Spotify had already crossed 60 million active users, and Apple, with its imminent launch of Apple Music, was positioned to accelerate that transformation faster than anyone had anticipated. The promise of streaming was always the same: music everywhere, instantly, infinitely. The cost, buried in the terms and the royalty statements, was that the people who made the music received almost nothing for the privilege of being everywhere. The standard per-stream royalty, fractions of a cent, had already turned the economics of mid-tier artistry into something close to an impossibility. An independent songwriter could register 10 million streams in a calendar year and walk away with less than the advance she had received a decade earlier for a modest debut album. The math was not complicated. The math was, in fact, the whole problem. Apple Music's announcement of its free trial model had landed in the industry like a slow-moving stone dropped into a still pond. The concentric rings spread quietly at first. The company intended to offer users 3 free months of its streaming service before billing began, and during that trial window it planned to pay artists and labels nothing. 0 royalties for 3 months. The logic from Apple's perspective was not without internal coherence. It was standard practice in subscription business models. A customer acquisition cost absorbed by the service itself rather than passed along to the consumer. Apple was spending enormous sums on the launch, on marketing, on infrastructure. The free trial was a mechanism for growth. The artists in this accounting would benefit from the exposure, from the eventual subscriber base, from the long game. The artists were asked, as they so often were, to trust the long game. Taylor Swift had already played her own version of this game once and lost faith in it. In November of 2014, she had removed her entire catalog from Spotify following the release of 1989, citing the platform's freemium model as fundamentally devaluing music for the artists who created it. The decision had been met with the predictable spectrum of responses: admiration from artists, irritation from streaming advocates, the inevitable think pieces about whether she was a visionary or a populist protecting her commercial interest under the banner of principle. What mattered less than the debate was the fact: she had acted. She had looked at a system she believed was broken, and she had withdrawn her participation from it, at real cost to her visibility and her streaming revenue, because she believed the principle was worth the price. The Apple Music situation was different in one critical dimension. Apple was not a startup. Apple was not a scrappy Swedish company, still negotiating its legitimacy with the major labels. Apple was the largest company in the world by market capitalization, sitting on more than $170 billion in cash reserves at the time of the announcement. It was, on any conceivable ledger, a company that could afford to pay artists during its free trial period. The choice not to was not a financial necessity. It was a policy decision. And policy decisions, Taylor Swift had come to understand, could be changed if the right person made the right argument in the right way. She published the letter on the morning of June 21, 2015, on Tumblr, where she had long maintained a direct line to her audience. She titled it "To Apple, Love Taylor." The register was deliberate, not a press release, not a legal filing, not a formal complaint routed through management and label attorneys. A letter. The kind of thing you wrote when you wanted someone to understand that you were speaking as a human being and not as a corporate entity, when you wanted the transaction of the exchange to feel personal because it was, in fact, personal. The argument she made was surgical. She did not attack streaming as a concept. She did not relitigate her Spotify withdrawal or invite that particular debate back to the surface. She focused, with almost lawyerly precision, on the specific moral logic of the free trial decision. She wrote that she was not withholding 1989 from Apple Music out of greed. And she was not doing it as a negotiating tactic. She was doing it because she could not in good conscience contribute her work to a platform that had explicitly decided, for a period of 3 months, not to compensate the songwriters, producers, and independent artists who had spent years building the very catalog Apple was using to attract its subscriber base. She named those people. She made sure the reader understood that this was not about Taylor Swift's bottom line. 1989 had already sold well over 1 million copies in its first week and would go on to become one of the best-selling albums of the decade. She was not the artist who needed the Apple trial royalties to make rent. She was speaking, she made clear, for the ones who did. "This is not about me," she wrote. "This is about the new artist or band that just released their first single and will not be paid for its success. This is about the songwriter who just got his or her first cut and thought that the royalties from that would get them out of debt. This is about the producer who works tirelessly to innovate and create, just like the innovators and creators at Apple are pioneering in their field." The precision of that last move, drawing a parallel between Apple's own innovators, people the company lionized and celebrated, and the musical innovators being asked to work for free, was the kind of rhetorical judo that made the argument very nearly impossible to rebut on its own terms. Eddie Q, Apple's senior vice president of Internet Software and Services, and the executive most directly responsible for Apple Music, responded within hours. Not days. Hours. He reached out through back channels before the letter had finished its first morning of viral circulation, and by early afternoon he had posted publicly that Apple would pay artists during the free trial period. The policy had changed. A corporation with $170 billion in cash had looked at a 25-year-old woman's Tumblr post and reversed course before the news cycle had completed a single rotation. What happened in the space between the letter's publication and Q's response is not fully documented in any official record, but the timeline itself constitutes the documentation. The letter had accumulated hundreds of thousands of shares within its first few hours. Major label executives, independent artists, music journalists, and cultural commentators had amplified it with a speed and unanimity that reflected not merely celebrity solidarity, but something closer to a pressure system reaching critical mass. The music industry had been waiting for someone to say, publicly and without hedging, what everyone in every conference room and every royalty accounting office already knew. Taylor Swift had said it, and she had said it in a way that was undeniable, specific, generous in its argument, and strategically impeccable in its refusal to be about her. Scott Borchetta, founder of Big Machine Records, and the man who had signed Swift at 14 and guided her from a Nashville teenager with a guitar into a cultural institution, had spent years understanding the particular nature of her instincts. He had watched her, over the course of a decade, develop a quality that was rare even among the most commercially successful artists he had known: a capacity to hold the emotional and the analytical in the same moment, to feel something deeply and simultaneously construct the argument for it in real time. The Apple letter was, in his accounting, not a surprise. It was an expression of something he had seen in embryo form in the first meetings they had ever had, when a 12-year-old from Pennsylvania had walked into his Nashville office and explained, with unsettling clarity, exactly what she intended to do with her life and why. That girl had grown into a woman who understood with equal clarity that the power she had built was not a personal possession. It was a lever. And levers were for moving things. Their relationship in this period was approaching a complexity neither had yet fully articulated. Borchetta had given Swift her foundation, her earliest infrastructure, her first real proof that the world would receive what she had to offer. Big Machine had been the architecture of her ascent. But she was, by 2015, something the architecture had not entirely anticipated. An artist whose cultural footprint now exceeded the institutional frame that had helped produce it, whose decisions were made on a scale and with an autonomy that made the traditional label artist dynamic feel at moments like a category that no longer quite fit. Neither of them could have named it precisely in that summer. What was becoming clear to anyone watching closely was that the question of who held what kind of power over her catalog, her legacy, and her future was not yet resolved. It was simply, for the moment, deferred. The Apple victory did something to the public understanding of Taylor Swift that was more significant than any chart position or album certification. It established in concrete and legible terms that she was not merely a beneficiary of the music industry's systems, she was capable of changing them. The artist who had seemed, through the lens of her earlier career, to be a skilled navigator of commercial machinery had revealed herself to be something else. A person who would, at the right moment, walk directly up to the machine and tell it to reconfigure. The music industry took note. The technology sector took note. And the broader culture, which had spent years trying to determine what exactly Taylor Swift represented, was she country? Was she pop? Was she a brand? Was she a movement? Received a new piece of evidence that did not fit neatly into any of those categories. She was something it did not have a clean word for. A private citizen with public power who had decided, apparently without anguish or performance, to use it. What she could not have anticipated, sitting in her Tribeca apartment in the summer of 2015 with the letter already published and the responses already flooding in, was that the very clarity she had demonstrated, the capacity to identify an injustice, name it, and apply pressure, would eventually be turned back toward her own history, toward contracts signed in a different city in a different decade, toward the question of who owned the recordings that had made all of this possible in the first place. She had changed a policy at Apple in an afternoon. The battle that was coming would not be resolved in an afternoon. It would not be resolved in a summer. It would become the defining legal and emotional struggle of her professional life, and it had already begun, invisibly, quietly, in the fine print of arrangements she had made as a teenager who trusted the people around her because she had not yet learned what trust could cost. Chapter 45. The Curation of the Pop Squad. The photograph arrives before the summer does. It surfaces in June of 2015 on Taylor Swift's Instagram feed, and it stops the internet mid-scroll. A constellation of women arranged on a beach in Rhode Island, sun-bronzed and luminous, draped across one another with the careless ease of people who have never once worried about belonging. Karlie Kloss is there, 6 feet of supermodel architecture folded into the sand like origami. Selena Gomez leans against someone's shoulder. Cara Delevingne grins wide enough to swallow the horizon. Behind them, fireworks burst against the dark sky, red and gold and extravagant, the kind of sky that seems to exist only in movies about people who have everything. And at the center of it all, grinning with the controlled warmth of someone who understands exactly what the camera is recording, is Taylor Swift. She is 25 years old. She is the most commercially powerful musician on the planet. And she has built, with the patience and intentionality of an architect, a social world that functions less like a friendship circle and more like a declaration. To understand what the squad meant, what it was designed to mean, you have to understand what Taylor Swift was stepping into when she arrived in New York City in the fall of 2014. The move was not merely geographic. It was a thesis statement. She had left Nashville behind, severed herself from the twang and the storytelling economy of country, and planted her flag in the most aggressively observed cultural landscape in the world. The album she was about to release, 1989, had already been announced as a full pivot to pop, a clean break, a reinvention so deliberate it had a name and a birthday. August 1989, her birth month, her aesthetic rebirth. But reinvention in pop is never a solo act. The culture of the mid-2010s demanded corroboration. In the age of Instagram and the curated self, a new identity required witnesses. The social media ecosystem in 2015 was entering a peculiar adolescence. Facebook had already calcified into something parents used. Twitter was raw and reactive, a place where reputations dissolved without warning. But Instagram was a stage, and it rewarded exactly the kind of visual storytelling that Taylor Swift had spent a decade mastering through music videos and award show moments. The platform's logic was aspirational and cinematic, the best life rendered in soft light. What the squad provided was aspiration in human form. Each member of Taylor's circle was herself a brand, herself a reference point. Lena Dunham for downtown literary credibility, Gigi Hadid and Martha Hunt for the runway, Hayam for indie cool, Uzo Aduba and Soraya for a strategic if imperfect gesture toward diversity. Together, they composed a kind of living mood board for the 1989 era, a visual argument that Taylor Swift did not merely make culture, she inhabited it at its most rarefied altitude. She hosted them at her apartment on Cornelia Street. She baked cookies and photographed the process. She brought them on stage during the 1989 World Tour, which grossed over $250 million and became the highest-earning North American concert tour in history at that point, and she introduced each of them to arenas of 60,000 people as though the friendship itself were a show number, another hit in the set list. The crowd screamed for Cara Delevingne with the same abandon they screamed for Blank Space. The message was ambient and total. Taylor Swift's world was the world you wanted to live in, and the people she loved were people worth loving. This was the core conflict she was navigating, though she would not have named it that way herself. The tension between genuine human connection and the machinery of image-making had by 2015 become nearly impossible to separate. She had spoken often in interviews leading up to and through the 1989 era about the loneliness of her early 20s, the years when public romantic catastrophe had made her feel surveilled and diminished, when every tearful exit from a restaurant became a gif, when the shorthand for her name in the culture was not genius or ambition, but serial heartbreak. The squad in her telling was the corrective. These were her people, her anchors, the women who showed up at her door when the noise got too loud. The feeling in those words, when she spoke them, was real. No performance can sustain itself across years of close observation without some bedrock of truth beneath it. And yet the architecture was undeniable. Even admirers who accepted the authenticity of the friendships could see the structure beneath them. The choreography of appearances, the timing of photographs, the way the circle expanded and contracted in rhythm with the album cycle. The squad launched with 1989 and reached its visual peak during the tour's summer run. By the time Reputation arrived in 2017, the squad had quietly receded, its members dispersed back into their own orbits as though the director had called cut. That rhythm of gathering and releasing, of visibility and strategic retreat, was not accidental. It was Taylor Swift's primary creative language applied to human relationships. She had always understood that meaning is made through curation. The criticism, when it came, was sharpest from women writers who had spent their careers thinking about the politics of female visibility. In a widely circulated essay, the journalist Ja Tolentino wrote with precision about the squad as a phenomenon that aestheticized female friendship while evacuating its political content, that the image of these extraordinary, uniformly thin, mostly white women celebrating one another on Instagram was less a model of solidarity than a luxury advertisement in the shape of one. Others pointed to what the circle excluded as much as what it included. The diversity it gestured toward without fully enacting, the way the friendship's public face seemed calibrated for maximum demographic reach rather than radical inclusion. The critique was not that Taylor Swift's friendships were fake. It was that they had been formatted, processed through the same brand logic that governed everything else in the 1989 machine. And that formatting had its own ideological content, visible or not to the woman doing the curating. Taylor Swift did not respond to these arguments directly, at least not in the critical period. Her public statements about the squad remained in the register of warmth and gratitude. These women had saved her, she said, or something close to it. And in the specific texture of her relationship with Karlie Kloss, the one that seemed to carry the most genuine freight during these years, there was something that resisted the cynicism. Kloss had entered her life in 2012, had become the kind of friend who appeared not in photographs, but in the margins of ordinary time. Road trips, late nights, the kind of company that asks nothing of your public self. In 2015, when Vogue ran a cover story on the two of them baking together in Taylor's kitchen, the image was both spontaneous and constructed, warm and staged, because that was the condition of their friendship by then. The private and the public had grown so intertwined that neither woman could fully separate them. They did not seem to mind. Or if they did, they had made their peace with it. There is a moment from the 1989 World Tour that cuts closer to the bone than any photograph. It comes from the Los Angeles stop in August of 2015, when Taylor brings Misty Copeland on stage, the first African-American woman to be named principal dancer of the American Ballet Theater, a woman whose ascent had been freighted with the weight of exclusion and perseverance in ways Taylor Swift's had never been. The crowd roars. Taylor beams. Copeland dances. It is genuinely thrilling as spectacle, and it is also, if you are watching a certain way, a perfect crystallization of the squad's essential dynamic, the extraordinary women in Taylor's orbit brought into her light, elevated by the association, while the terms of that elevation remain hers to set. She was the stage. She was the platform. And she was generous with both, generously and on her own terms. The cultural theorist might call this soft power. The economists of attention might call it network effects. Taylor Swift would call it gratitude, and she would mean it, and she would also not be wrong. The squad gave her something she had genuinely lacked, a publicly legible identity that was not organized around romantic loss. In the years between Speak Now and 1989, the narrative architecture of her public life had been built almost entirely from the raw material of her relationships with men. The falling in, the burning out, the album that followed. The squad reoriented that architecture toward female solidarity, toward the idea that her most sustaining connections were not vertical, not upward to power, not downward to the audience, but horizontal, reciprocal, loud with laughter. That was a real thing she made. That it also served her brand so perfectly was a coincidence only in the narrowest sense of the word. By the end of the 1989 era, the squad had been written about so extensively that it had taken on a life independent of the friendships themselves. It was a meme, a reference point, a unit of cultural shorthand. Saturday Night Live parodied it. Critics ranked its members by relevance. Think pieces contested its politics. None of this diminished its effectiveness as image architecture. If anything, the controversy deepened the imprint, made it more culturally durable than any purely positive phenomenon could have been. Taylor Swift had built, perhaps without fully intending to, a social formation that was simultaneously a genuine expression of who she was and a precision instrument of cultural dominance. And the line between those two things had become so thin by 2016 that even she, in her most honest moments, might have struggled to tell you where one ended and the other began. What she had not yet calculated, what no one inside the sun-drenched perimeter of those Rhode Island beach photographs had paused to consider, was the cost of building an identity so publicly, so visibly, on a foundation of light and color and chosen people. She had constructed a world, and the world had noticed, and in noticing it had begun to accumulate a quiet resentment that had nothing to do with the sincerity of her friendships, and everything to do with the totality of the image she had made. The internet, which had given her the stage, had also been watching. It was taking notes. And somewhere outside the frame of every perfectly lit photograph, in the portions of the internet that did not traffic in warmth or aspiration, a counter-narrative was forming, patient, accumulating, waiting for a single moment of perceived overreach to ignite. The squad's perfect summer had one more season left before the sky changed color entirely. Chapter 46. 1989 World Tour, the Global Victory Lap. The stage had not yet been lit when the first tremor moved through the crowd. It began in the upper decks of Levi's Stadium in Santa Clara, a low collective vibration, the kind that travels up through the soles of shoes and settles somewhere between the sternum and the throat. 70,000 people, many of whom had been in their seats for 3 hours before the scheduled start time, pressing forward against railings and craning above shoulders, all of them trained on a single dark runway that extended from the main stage into the heart of the floor. Backstage, behind a wall of monitors cycling through camera feeds and technical readouts, Taylor Swift stood in a white bodysuit trimmed in silver, her hair pinned beneath a headpiece that caught the prep lights in fractured sparks. She was not watching the crowd. She was watching the countdown clock mounted to a structural column, 4 minutes, 41 seconds, and she was mouthing something inaudible, her lips moving in a precise and private rhythm, the kind of self-rehearsal that had nothing to do with lyrics and everything to do with the controlled management of adrenaline. The countdown reached 3 minutes. She exhaled through her nose. She did not look away from the clock. What was unfolding in May 2015, at the opening dates of the 1989 World Tour, was not simply the launch of a concert cycle. It was the public consecration of an identity she had spent 2 years constructing. Carefully, deliberately, with the methodical precision of someone who understood that transformation, to be believed, must be total. The album that bore the tour's name had arrived in October 2014 as an unambiguous declaration. She was no longer a country artist who had learned to write pop songs. She was a pop artist who had shed every residual expectation her earlier genre had placed upon her. The cowboy boots were gone. The acoustic guitar was gone. In their place, a synth-saturated, drum machine-driven aesthetic borrowed from the 1980s and reprocessed through the production sensibilities of Max Martin and Shellback, 2 architects of contemporary commercial music who understood exactly how much sonic space a single chorus could occupy. The record had sold 1.287 million copies in its first week of United States release alone, the highest single-week total in 12 years, a figure that, in an era of precipitous streaming fragmentation, read less like a sales statistic and more like an argument. The tour that followed was designed to make that argument physical. By 2015, the live concert industry had completed its transformation into the dominant revenue engine of popular music. The collapse of the album as a mass commercial object, a collapse accelerated by streaming services whose per-play royalty structures returned fractions of a cent to recording artists, had redirected the financial logic of the entire industry toward the stage. Artists who had once treated touring as promotion for records now understood that the record existed, in economic terms, to promote the tour. The largest acts in the world, U2, the Rolling Stones, Beyoncé, had reorganized their business models accordingly, constructing stadium spectacles that justified ticket prices in the triple digits and generated 9-figure gross revenues across a single cycle. Swift had toured stadiums before, during the Red Era, but those performances, while technically accomplished, had operated within a scale that still belonged to the previous decade's conception of what a Swift show could be. The 1989 World Tour was conceived at a different magnitude entirely. It would span 5 continents, visit 85 cities, sell out stadiums that seated between 50,000 and 100,000 people, and gross, in total, more than $250 million, a number that would ultimately be revised upward as additional dates were added to meet demand that the original itinerary had failed to anticipate. The challenge was not logistical, though the logistics were staggering. The challenge was existential. She had built an audience on intimacy. The foundational contract of her early career, the diary entry lyrics, the eye contact held across arena floors, the meet and greets, extended past any reasonable hour of the night, had produced a fan relationship of unusual depth and particularity. Her listeners did not feel that they were consuming a product. They felt that they were in a correspondence. To move that relationship into a stadium configuration, where the artist is necessarily reduced by distance to a figure on a screen and a voice through a speaker array, was to risk breaking the very bond that had made the enterprise possible. Critics had raised the point with something approaching gleeful anticipation. The intimacy, they argued, was a function of scale, and the scale she was now choosing would dissolve it. They were correct about the arithmetic. They had misread the architecture. The stage design addressed the problem before it could become a crisis. Working with production designers and lighting engineers who had spent years on arena-level productions, Swift and her team constructed a set that rejected the conventional logic of the stadium concert, the single massive stage to which all sightlines converge, the passive relationship between performer and crowd. Instead, the 1989 tour built a performance environment that moved. The B-stage extended far into the floor. Aerial lifts carried Swift and her dancers above the crowd at intervals that brought her within feet of fans in sections that traditional staging would have left at a remove of 300 yards. The screen infrastructure, massive LED panels deployed in configurations that changed shape and dimension across the show, was calibrated not to project scale but to preserve legibility, to keep her face readable to the person in the last row of the upper deck. The effect was of a show that could expand to fill 100,000-person space without abandoning the person in it. The intimacy was not lost. It was engineered. A moment during the Nashville run in September illustrated what that engineering made possible. Between songs, at a point in the set when the arena had settled into the particular collective silence that follows extreme noise, the ringing, held-breath silence of 70,000 people simultaneously catching their breath, Swift crouched at the edge of the B-stage and spoke without amplification to a section of the floor crowd close enough to hear her actual voice above the fading monitor mix. She was not delivering a prepared remark. She was talking to 3 or 4 people who had held a hand-painted sign through the opening act, and what she said was specific to the sign, specific to the faces she was reading, specific to the moment. The exchange lasted perhaps 45 seconds. But in an arena that large, the act of speaking without the microphone, of choosing at the precise midpoint of a multi-million-dollar production to simply talk to someone, registered to everyone who witnessed it as something close to theatrical rebellion. The audience around those 3 or 4 people fell quiet, with the attentiveness of people who understood they were watching something unscripted happen inside a script. It was a small thing. It was also exactly the thing. No element of the tour's cultural impact was more closely analyzed, more fiercely celebrated, and more quietly consequential than the sequence of guest appearances that became a signature feature of the summer stadium dates. The pattern had been established during the arena run and refined as the shows scaled upward. At a designated point in each performance, a surprise guest would emerge from the wings to join Swift on stage for 1 or 2 songs. The guests were not announced in advance. The selection was deliberate and varied, musicians from genres entirely outside Swift's own, actors, models, athletes, figures whose presence on a Taylor Swift stage signaled something about the breadth of the cultural territory she was now occupying. Selena Gomez, Lena Dunham, Ellen DeGeneres, Lisa Kudrow, Mick Jagger, Alanis Morissette, Natalie Maines. The list accumulated across the summer into something that read less like a series of individual bookings and more like a map of an empire whose borders she was publicly marking. Each appearance was photographed, shared, analyzed, debated. The cumulative effect was to position Swift not merely as a successful recording artist, but as a connective node in the broader celebrity ecosystem. A figure whose relationships, professional and personal, extended across every adjacent domain of popular culture. This was, in part, the work of a year that had preceded the tour. The friendship group that Swift had assembled and cultivated throughout 2014 and into 2015, a rotating constellation of models, actresses, and musicians who appeared alongside her at public events and in carefully staged social media content, had become one of the most discussed cultural phenomena of the moment. Its members were photographed together at award shows, at 4th of July gatherings at her Rhode Island estate, at the sidelines of sporting events. The group had a name, deployed without irony in the entertainment press: the Squad. The Squad generated a volume of media coverage that would have cost a conventional publicist millions of dollars to engineer, and it functioned in the ecosystem of 2015 celebrity discourse as both genuine friendship and strategic brand amplification, two things that were not, Swift understood, mutually exclusive. What the tour's guest appearances did was to extend the Squad logic into the stadium itself, to make the audience complicit in the social world she was performing. When Cara Delevingne walked on stage in London, and the crowd of 80,000 people at Wembley Stadium erupted with the particular intensity of recognition, the reaction was not simply enthusiasm for a famous face. It was the response of people who felt they already knew the friendship, who had watched its construction in real time across Instagram feeds and tabloid pages, and who were now being invited to celebrate it in person. Karlie Kloss occupied a specific weight in that constellation. The model and Swift had met at a Victoria's Secret fashion show in 2012, and had developed, over the subsequent years, a friendship of notable public visibility. Kloss appeared on stage at multiple 1989 tour dates, and the dynamic between them, easy, physical, the kind of comfort that reads as long familiarity, registered on the enormous screens above the crowd with an authenticity that the more formally staged guest appearances sometimes lacked. In the coverage of the tour, the friendship was read as evidence of Swift's social evolution, her transition from a Nashville girl navigating an unfamiliar industry to a figure who moved with total confidence through the intersecting worlds of fashion, music, and celebrity culture. What the cameras caught between them was genuine, or at least appeared so, the specific warmth of two people who have watched each other carefully enough to stop performing for each other, who have arrived at the particular ease of real companionship. It was, in the context of a tour devoted to controlled image construction, the most effective image of all precisely because it appeared uncontrolled. The friendship would, in the years ahead, become the subject of speculation and revisionary reading that neither woman had anticipated in the summer of 2015, when Kloss raised Swift's hand above the Wembley stage, and the crowd noise reached a frequency that the structural engineers later noted had approached the building's resonance threshold. The numbers, when the tour concluded in December 2015 in Melbourne, Australia, were not simply large. They were definitional. $251 million in gross revenue. 2 million tickets sold across the North American leg alone. Merchandise sales that her management declined to characterize publicly, but that industry analysts estimated placed in the same category as the touring gross itself. The trade publication Pollstar would name it the highest-grossing North American tour of the year, a designation that, in a year when multiple legacy acts and stadium-scale operations had mounted their own major runs, meant something specific about where she now stood in the hierarchy of live entertainment. She was not among the top touring acts in her genre. She was among the top touring acts in the world, measured against every genre, every generation, every scale of enterprise. The infrastructure that had been assembled to support the tour, the crew of hundreds, the production assets that traveled in dozens of trucks across multiple continents, the logistical operation that required the coordination of local vendors, security operations, and municipal governments in 85 cities, was the infrastructure of a permanent institution, not a temporary event cycle. She had not simply mounted a successful tour. She had demonstrated the existence of an organization capable of sustaining operations at a scale that most artists never approach and none maintain without years of accumulated systems. In the weeks following the Melbourne closing night, as the tour's assets were inventoried and its revenues reconciled, Swift returned to the apartment in Tribeca that had become her primary residence since the move to New York that had begun the 1989 era. The city was in the early cold of a December that had started mild and then shifted without warning into the sharp clarity of actual winter. She had been on the road, in various configurations, for the better part of 2 years. The apartment was quiet in the way that only long empty spaces are quiet, not peaceful, but vacated, the particular silence of rooms that have been maintained in one's absence by someone else. She had told interviewers, during the tour's run, that she felt most like herself on stage. The statement had read in print as performance. In the Tribeca quiet, it may have been the most honest thing she said all year. What she did not yet know in that December stillness was that the very architecture she had built so carefully, the friendships performed at stadium scale, the squad deployed as cultural currency, the omnipresence cultivated across every platform simultaneously, had begun, in ways she could not yet perceive, to accumulate a different kind of attention, and that the apparatus of visibility she had constructed to protect her would, in the year ahead, become the very mechanism through which she would be most completely exposed. Chapter 47. The 58th Annual Grammy Awards, Album of the Year Dualism. The air inside Staples Center had been holding its breath for hours. It was February 15, 2016, and the room, cavernous, glittering, humming with the particular electricity of people who had learned to perform ease, was reaching the moment that every Grammy telecast builds toward with the patience of a tide. Album of the Year. The final award. The one that, in the architecture of the music industry's most watched evening, functions less as a prize and more as a verdict. Not simply on the record being honored, but on the era the record had defined, the argument it had made about what popular music was allowed to be. Taylor Swift sat in the audience wearing a black and white Atelier Versace gown, its geometric lines a kind of armor. She had already performed that evening, a kinetic pyrotechnic staging of Out of the Woods that opened the broadcast and announced immediately that this was not a woman who had arrived to receive. She had arrived to claim. But in the seconds before the envelope was opened, even she could not fully control what her face revealed. A stillness behind the eyes that was not calm so much as concentration. The expression of someone who has rehearsed composure until it becomes its own form of tension. LL Cool J read the name. 1989. Taylor Swift. What followed, the rush to the stage, the sequined blur, the roar, was documented and replayed and analyzed and debated. But the moment that preceded it, that fraction of a second before the room confirmed what the envelope already knew, contained something the cameras could not quite capture. It was the weight of what the win meant, not just biographically but historically, pressing down on a 26-year-old woman who had spent the better part of 3 years engineering a transformation so complete that the music industry was still struggling to process it. She was, in that instant, the first woman in the history of the Grammy Awards to win Album of the Year twice as a lead artist. Santana had done it. Simon and Garfunkel had done it. Frank Sinatra. But not a woman. Not once, in 58 years of the award's existence. The category had been, quietly and without anyone ever stating it plainly, a room to which women were invited but not expected to stay. Taylor Swift had just moved in the furniture. To understand the magnitude of the 58th Grammy moment, it is necessary to understand where the music industry stood in early 2016, and where it believed Taylor Swift stood within it. Streaming had ceased to be a future disruption and had become the present reality. Spotify's user base had crossed 75 million. Apple Music had launched the previous June. The Album of the Year category itself was under increasing cultural scrutiny. Critics debated whether the award had become disconnected from the actual center of popular music, whether the Grammy electorate, older, more traditional, more suspicious of hip-hop's dominance, was capable of recognizing what a generation of listeners actually considered significant. 1989 had been released in October 2014, and its commercial performance had been, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. It debuted with 1.287 million copies sold in its first week, the largest sales week for any album in over a decade. It produced 7 top 10 singles. It won the Grammy for Album of the Year in 2016, alongside a sweep that included Best Pop Vocal Album. But the numbers, dazzling as they were, only partly explain why the album occupied the cultural space it did. 1989 was, at its core, an argument. It was Taylor Swift declaring, in the clearest possible artistic terms, that she was no longer operating within the genre that had made her famous. She had stepped out of Nashville's amber and into something wider, stranger, more combustible. She was making a claim on pop music's center, not its periphery, not its country crossover lane, but its absolute center. And she was making it at the precise moment when that center felt most contested. The music industry had, not without affection, developed a working theory about Taylor Swift in the years leading up to 1989. She was immensely talented. She was extraordinarily hard-working. She understood her audience with an almost uncanny precision. But the theory held that she existed within a defined and somewhat comfortable category. The country pop crossover, the songwriter whose earnestness was her brand, whose relatability was her engine. She was beloved, the theory went, in the particular way that things beloved for their familiarity are beloved. She was safe. 1989 was her refusal of that theory. The album's sonic palette, the synth-driven production of Max Martin and Shellback, the deliberate severing of any sonic thread to Nashville, the lyrical shift from romantic narrative to something more impressionistic and urban, was not simply a creative evolution. It was a strategic and philosophical repositioning. And it came with a confrontation built directly into its release. Swift removed her entire catalog from Spotify in November 2014, publicly arguing that streaming services undervalued both music and musicians. The move was widely covered, widely debated, and widely criticized by figures within the tech and music industries, who viewed it as a retrograde act by an artist who didn't yet understand where the world was heading. She understood precisely where the world was heading. That was exactly why she did it. The core obstacle Swift navigated in the period surrounding the 58th Grammy Awards was not logistical or even primarily industry-related. It was something subtler and more corrosive: the emerging cultural narrative that her success was somehow too total, too managed, too deliberately constructed to be fully authentic. The critical conversation around 1989, even at its most laudatory, carried a faint but persistent undertone of suspicion. The album was excellent, the argument went, but it was excellent in a calculated way. The squad, the highly publicized group of celebrity friends she had assembled and brought into her public persona, felt to some observers less like genuine friendship than like brand architecture. Her responses to controversies, pointed, articulate, carefully timed, suggested a level of media management that made some critics uncomfortable. She was in this telling too aware, too strategic, too much in control of her own image to be entirely trustworthy. This critique was applied to female artists with a consistency it was rarely applied to their male counterparts. Kanye West's elaborate self-mythologizing was called genius. Jay-Z's business acumen was called empire building. When Taylor Swift demonstrated equivalent levels of strategic intelligence about her own career and public image, it was called calculation, as though intentionality were a form of inauthenticity available only to women. She was, in a sense, being penalized for the very qualities that the music industry had spent decades insisting successful artists must possess. She navigated this by doing the one thing it is impossible to effectively criticize. She kept making the music better. There is a specific moment from the Grammy evening that functions, in retrospect, as a keyhole into the larger architecture of Swift's character. It comes not from her acceptance speech, though the speech was itself carefully constructed and deliberately pointed. It comes from an exchange, documented afterward, discussed in the days that followed, between what she chose to say and what she chose not to say. Kanye West had released Famous in February 2016, just days before the Grammy broadcast, a track that included a lyric about Swift that was, depending on one's interpretation, either a provocative artistic gesture or a straightforward act of gendered humiliation. The line, claiming credit for her fame, describing her with a misogynistic epithet, became one of the dominant conversations in popular music in the first weeks of the year. It was the kind of controversy that demanded response, that seemed to require Swift to either defend herself loudly or absorb the hit quietly. Both options were traps. Loud defense risked extending the story, platforming the lyric, allowing the narrative to be shaped by her reaction. Quiet absorption risked being read as acquiescence, as confirmation that the lyric had landed as intended. She found a third path. During her Grammy acceptance speech for Album of the Year, Swift addressed the controversy without ever naming it directly. She spoke about people who try to take credit for a woman's success, about the necessity of ignoring that noise, about building something they cannot take away from you. The speech was measured, pointed, and self-possessed in a way that revealed something essential about how she operated under pressure. She did not match fire with fire. She redirected the flame into fuel. The controversy had given her a platform. She used it to say what she had been trying to say for years about women, about credit, about the particular resistance that ambitious women encounter in every industry. She turned a moment of public humiliation into a statement about public power. The audience gave her a standing ovation. This was not instinct. It was architecture. And the distinction matters because it speaks to a quality in Swift that is frequently mistaken for coldness, when it is actually something closer to precision. She had been in public life long enough to understand that the Grammy stage, with its audience of millions, was not a moment for unmediated emotion. It was a moment for considered language. The consideration, far from diminishing the authenticity of what she said, amplified it. She meant every word. She had simply chosen them with care. The relationship that took on the most significant weight during this period, and that would prove the most consequential for both parties, was Swift's long-running entanglement with the mechanisms of media narrative, embodied most specifically in the evolving relationship between her public self and her private creative process. But the human relationship that best illuminates this moment is the one she maintained with her mother, Andrea Swift, who had been diagnosed with cancer during the 1989 World Tour. Andrea Swift's diagnosis was not disclosed publicly until April 2015, when Taylor mentioned it at a concert after a fan in the audience shared that her own mother had cancer. The moment was unscripted, genuinely unscripted, the kind of spontaneity that cannot be manufactured, and it revealed the degree to which the most personal architecture of Swift's life remained insulated from the apparatus of her public persona. She had been carrying this knowledge throughout the final stages of the album's promotional cycle, through the touring infrastructure, through the cultural onslaught of celebrity and scrutiny and expectation. She had carried it largely privately. The Grammy win in February 2016, occurred during a period when Andrea's health remained a sustained source of anxiety. What this meant, for a woman who processed most of her emotional life through songwriting, was that 1989, the album being honored that night, had been made in a period of gathering personal fear that the album itself did not fully contain. The synthesis of that fear, and of everything else she was living through, would wait. It was accumulating. It was looking for its form. The Grammy stage, with its history and its lights and its verdict, was not the place where it would emerge. The applause in Staples Center lasted longer than usual. The cameras caught her hugging her mother in the audience, and the image, the historic winner, the Grammy in hand, the mother who had nearly been lost, circulated widely in the hours that followed. It was, as images from her life often were, simultaneously entirely true and entirely insufficient. It captured a moment without capturing the years that had built it. It showed the arrival without showing the cost. She stood at the microphone a second time that night, the award in her hands, in a room that had just confirmed something it had never confirmed before, and she spoke about the future with the particular cadence of someone who has learned to treat the future as a problem to be solved rather than a promise to be trusted. She thanked her fans. She thanked her team. She said what needed to be said, and she said it well, and then the lights moved on to something else, as lights always do. What the cameras could not see, what the applause could not reach, was the file she was already building. Not literally. There was no notebook backstage, no voice memo running in the pocket of the Versace gown. But something in her was already organizing the next stage, had been organizing it even as the Album of the Year trophy cooled in her hands. She had built 1989 as a document of arrival, of self-definition, of a woman claiming a genre and a cultural center on her own terms. She had won the argument she set out to make. The problem with winning arguments, as she was beginning to understand, is that winning them does not end them. It intensifies them. It raises the volume of every force that had already been gathering against her, and it introduces new forces she had not yet anticipated. The squad would not survive the year intact. The Kanye controversy would not end with a Grammy speech. The private grief she had been managing would not remain private. And the album she was beginning to hear in the back of her mind, darker, more confrontational, less interested in being liked than anything she had ever made, was already taking shape in the space between the celebration and the silence. The lights in Staples Center had not yet finished burning when the next chapter began to write itself. Chapter 48. The 2016 Snapchat and phone recording controversy. The notification arrived the way catastrophes always do in the digital age, without ceremony, without warning, without any of the atmospheric pressure that precedes a physical storm. It was a Sunday evening in July 2016, and somewhere across Los Angeles, Kim Kardashian West was sitting with her phone, her thumb hovering over a post that would, within minutes, reshape the architecture of American celebrity culture. Taylor Swift did not know it was coming. She was in the middle of a summer that had felt, on its surface, like a continuation of everything she had built. The sold-out stadiums, the magazine covers, the carefully tended image of a young woman who had been wronged before and had survived, who had turned grief into anthems and anthems into empire. And then the phone rang, or didn't ring, and the world shifted on its axis, and she was no longer the hero of the story she thought she had been living. The controversy that detonated that July was not born in July. It had its roots in a February evening more than a year earlier, when Kanye West released a track called Famous from his album The Life of Pablo, a song containing a lyric that referred to Taylor Swift in terms that were, depending on the interpreter, either transgressive satire or crude humiliation. The line was explicit. It was also, from the moment it surfaced in the cultural bloodstream, contested most vocally by Swift herself, who released a statement through her publicist making clear that she had never been informed of the lyric, had never approved it, and found it demeaning. West's camp countered immediately, suggesting that a conversation had taken place, that consent had been given, that Swift was constructing a narrative of victimhood that erased her own complicity. The dispute settled into an uneasy stasis, the kind of public argument that neither side wins so much as both sides survive, waiting to see which version of events the culture ultimately ratifies. What made the summer of 2016 structurally different from any controversy Swift had previously weathered was the nature of the evidence being deployed against her, and the velocity with which that evidence traveled. Social media had matured by then into something more than a platform for self-expression. It had become a mechanism for public trials, for the instantaneous convening of juries composed of millions of people who would render verdicts in the time it took to double-tap a screen. Kim Kardashian West, who had spent a decade building one of the most sophisticated personal media operations in the history of celebrity, understood this mechanism with a fluency that Swift, for all her own digital savvy, did not yet fully reckon with. When Kardashian elected to post video footage on Snapchat, footage of what appeared to be a phone call between West and Swift, in which Swift could be heard responding to the famous lyric with what sounded, in that clipped and contextless form, like approval, she was not merely entering a dispute. She was weaponizing the evidentiary logic of the digital age against someone who had built her entire public identity on the presumption of her own credibility. The footage spread with the speed that only genuine cultural detonations achieve. Within hours, the hashtag Taylor Swift is over party was trending globally. The irony embedded in that phrase, the casual cruelty of the word party, the collective glee at the prospect of a powerful woman's unraveling, spoke to something that transcended any single feud between any single set of celebrities. Swift had, by 2016, accumulated a level of cultural capital that made her not merely famous, but structurally dominant, and structural dominance in American popular culture generates its own resentments, its own quiet audiences waiting for the moment of reversal. The Snapchat footage gave those audiences permission. The pile-on that followed was not simply about a phone call, or a lyric, or a dispute over who had said what to whom. It was about the accumulated frustration of a public that had grown tired, or had been encouraged to grow tired, of being told how to feel about Taylor Swift. Swift's response came through Instagram, a platform she had used over the previous 2 years, with the same instinctive precision she brought to every other aspect of her public presentation. The statement she posted was careful and specific. She had been asked about the lyric referring to her as a bitch, she wrote, and she had told West she would not have approved that word, that this was the portion of the conversation she had not been made aware of in advance. It was a technical defense, a lawyerly parsing of the available facts, and it was also, in the crucible of that particular cultural moment, nearly impossible to hear. The counter-narrative had already been written. The footage had already circulated. The verdict, rendered by the distributed jury of the Internet, had already been delivered. She was not the victim. She was the snake. The emoji that flooded her Instagram comments in those hours, serpent after serpent after serpent, a biblical cascade of accusation, would within weeks migrate from insult to irony, and then, much later, from irony into armor. But that transformation was still years away. In July 2016, she was simply underwater. What the controversy exposed, and what the months that followed would render with increasing clarity, was the specific vulnerability that Swift's brand of authenticity had always carried within it. Her entire artistic identity rested on the proposition that she was honest, that the emotions in her songs were real, that the version of herself she offered to audiences corresponded to something true. She had staked that identity across 6 albums, across a decade of public life, across thousands of interviews in which she narrated herself with a consistency that her most devoted fans experienced as intimacy and her critics characterized as performance. The famous dispute did not merely challenge a single statement she had made, it challenged the epistemological foundation on which her public self was constructed. If she had, in fact, consented to the lyric and subsequently denied it, then the entire edifice of her self-narration was suspect. This was the blade the footage carried. It did not need to prove anything definitively to be devastating. It only needed to introduce doubt. The person who watched this unravel most closely, in the specific and bounded sense of those immediate weeks, was Scott Borchetta, Swift's longtime label chief at Big Machine Records, the man who had signed her as a teenager in Nashville and had helped architect every transition of her career since. Borchetta had shepherded her through the move from country to pop, had managed the commercial and critical machinery around 1989, had been the steady institutional presence behind the cultural explosion of the previous 2 years. His relationship with Swift was not uncomplicated. It was the relationship of a builder to his most significant creation, freighted with the particular dynamic that emerges when talent and commerce become so thoroughly intertwined that it is no longer possible to say where one ends and the other begins. In the aftermath of the Snapchat posting, Borchetta's role was crisis management of the most acute kind, not the management of bad press, which was routine, but the management of a moment in which his artist's foundational credibility was being publicly dismantled. What passed between them in those weeks has never been fully disclosed. What is visible in the public record is a silence that lasted far longer than any previous Swift controversy had required. No new music, no major public appearances, no interviews, no carefully orchestrated re-emergence into the cultural conversation. The silence was total, and it lasted months. The revealing action was not the Instagram statement, though that would be analyzed and scrutinized and parsed in the weeks that followed to the point of dissolution. The revealing action was what Swift did not do. She did not call additional press conferences. She did not release a rejoinder track. She did not perform the rapid counter-mobilization that her team had deployed in previous conflicts, the immediate recalibration of narrative that had served her so effectively in the years after the 2009 VMAs incident with West. She went quiet in a way that was entirely new, a way that suggested either exhaustion or strategy, or perhaps the first genuine recognition that neither the tools she had built nor the persona she had cultivated could absorb what was being done to her in real time. The quiet felt like surrender to those watching from outside. It was, as subsequent years would clarify, something else entirely. It was the beginning of a demolition, deliberate and controlled, of everything she had built in public, the first stage in what would become one of the most calculated artistic reinventions in the modern history of pop music. In the wider cultural context of that summer, the Swift-West Kardashian collision occupied a symbolic terrain that no single account of it could fully exhaust. 2016 was a year of cascading public polarizations, of accelerating arguments about authenticity and performance, about who was permitted to occupy which cultural space, about the specific and contested position of white women within intersecting structures of power and grievance. Swift existed at a precise and uncomfortable coordinate in all of those arguments simultaneously. She was enormously powerful, and had always successfully narrated herself as vulnerable. She was white and wealthy, and had frequently employed the grammar of victimhood in ways that critics had, with growing frequency, in the years preceding the controversy, begun to examine with something colder than sympathy. The Snapchat footage landed in this context, not as a neutral evidentiary dispute, but as the confirmation of a suspicion many had been carrying for years, a suspicion that had less to do with a phone call than with an entire mode of self-presentation that had, depending on one's vantage point, outlasted its own credibility. The culture had been waiting, even if it did not know it was waiting, for precisely this kind of rupture. What it received was not a rupture so much as a detonation, sudden, total, and clarifying. By the end of 2016, Swift had not released a statement in months. She had not been photographed at major events. The infrastructure of visibility that she had assembled with such deliberation across the 1989 era, the squad, the 4th of July celebrations, the constant stream of cheerful public documentation, had gone dark. The snake emoji had been adopted and tattooed and screen printed and threaded through the commentary of every profile written about her during those months, always present, always hissing. The public figure who had danced on stages in front of tens of thousands of people, who had waved from balconies and hugged fans and written handwritten notes and called herself lucky, had simply ceased to appear. What replaced her was absence, dense, deliberate, and beginning somewhere beneath the surface to harden into something new. There are moments in the lives of public figures when the mechanism of their success becomes indistinguishable from the mechanism of their undoing, when the same qualities that constructed their visibility become, under sufficient pressure, the exact qualities that make them most exposed. Swift had built an identity on the premise of sincerity, on the assertion that what you saw was what was real, and that premise had carried her from a Nashville teenager to the summit of global pop music in less than a decade. Now that premise was being interrogated with a ferocity commensurate with its own ambition. The question was not whether she would survive it. She had survived before. The question was what she would have to become in order to survive this particular fire, and whether the woman who emerged from it would still recognize herself in the person who had entered it. Somewhere in the silence of those final months of 2016, in whatever room she occupied while the world made up its mind about her, that transformation was already beginning, and its shape, still invisible, would prove far darker, far stranger, and far more artistically uncompromising than anything she had allowed herself to attempt before. Point 2. Chapter 49. The Civil Court Victory and Sexual Assault Advocacy. The deposition room in Denver smelled of recycled air and institutional carpet cleaner, the kind of scent that clings to every federal building in America, regardless of city or decade. Taylor Swift sat across a lacquered table from a row of attorneys she had never met, their yellow legal pads fanned out like the feathers of something predatory, and she did not look away. She was 27 years old. She had sold more records in the preceding 3 years than almost any artist alive. None of that was the point. The point, she understood with a clarity that surprised even her own legal team, was that she was going to say exactly what happened, in exactly the words it deserved, without softening a syllable for anyone's comfort. The incident itself had occurred 4 years earlier, in June of 2013, backstage at a radio meet and greet in Denver before a concert at the Pepsi Center. A photograph taken that evening showed her smiling alongside her mother Andrea, her then-boyfriend, and Kygo radio personality, David Muller. In the photograph, Mueller's hand was positioned behind her, and Swift would later testify in precise, anatomical language what that hand had done beneath her skirt in the seconds the camera shutter was open. She had told her mother immediately. Her team had notified Mueller's employer. Mueller had been fired within days. And then, in the particular cruelty that attaches itself to women who speak clearly about what was done to them, Mueller had turned around and sued her, and her mother, and her radio liaison Frank Bell, for tortious interference with his employment, seeking $3 million in damages and insisting in court documents and to the press that it had never happened. The year in which this lawsuit was finally tried, 2017, was a year still finding its seismic footing. The phrase "Me Too" had not yet become the shorthand for a cultural reckoning it would become that October, when the New York Times published its investigation into Harvey Weinstein, and the landscape shifted beneath an entire industry. But the pressure had been building for years along fault lines that predated any headline. Women across entertainment, across corporate America, across every institution that had ever asked them to smile through it, were beginning to speak in registers that could not be dismissed. Swift's trial opened in August of that year, 2 months before the hashtag, and it arrived into a culture that was simultaneously exhausted by the patterns of disbelief and newly dangerously awake to them. Her attorneys filed a counterclaim. $1. That was the figure she chose, not as a gesture of contempt, but as a deliberate architectural decision about what the lawsuit was actually for. She had stated it plainly in a written declaration. She was not seeking to profit. She was seeking to be believed on the record by a jury of her peers under oath. The dollar was the point. The dollar said, "This is not about money. This is about something that cannot be measured in money, and I am going to make you say so out loud in a courtroom." The legal strategy her team constructed around this premise was methodical and almost ruthless in its precision. Her lead attorney, Douglas Herrick, and his colleagues approached the case not as a he said she said impasse, which is how the defense preferred to frame it, but as a question of evidence, sequence, and credibility architecture. They had the photograph. They had Swift's contemporaneous account to her mother. They had the internal communications from her radio team documenting the complaint before Mueller's firing. What they would not do, and what her attorneys made clear in pretrial motions, was allow Mueller's legal team to introduce Swift's sexual history, her public reputation, or the details of her romantic relationships as evidence of anything whatsoever. Judge William Martinez agreed. The trial would be conducted on what actually happened and when. What the public saw when cameras captured Swift entering the Alfred A. Araj United States Courthouse each morning was something that defied easy categorization. She was not performing stoicism. Stoicism implies suppression, and she did not appear to be suppressing anything. She moved through the courthouse with a quality that longtime observers of her career recognized but struggled to name, a kind of structured intentionality, the same quality that had produced album rollouts of meticulous precision and public statements calibrated to the millimeter. She had thought carefully about what this week would mean and what she would be required to give it, and she had decided to give it everything, held to a very specific shape. On the witness stand, under cross-examination by Mueller's attorney Gabriel McFarland, she was asked whether it was possible the groping had been accidental, that Mueller's hand had simply ended up in the wrong position. She looked at McFarland for a moment before answering. "I don't need you to apologize to me," she said, in one of the exchange's most widely reported lines, "because I'm not going to let you or your client make me feel in any way that this is my fault. Here we are years later, and I'm being blamed for the unfortunate events of his life that are the product of his decisions, not mine." McFarland pressed again. Why hadn't she looked more upset in the photograph? Swift's answer was immediate. "Because I was at the time having a very fun backstage meet and greet with my fans," she said, "and his decisions were made without my knowledge." The exchange was brief. The effect was not. Within hours of the transcript reaching the internet, the clip had circulated across every platform that existed, and several that barely did. But what made it more than a viral moment, what made it a document, was the quality of the attention underneath it. She had not been performing composure. She had been applying, in a hostile environment, the same refusal to accept a false premise that had always characterized her most significant professional decisions. Mueller's attorney had offered her an exit ramp. Maybe it was an accident, maybe it was ambiguous, maybe the truth lived somewhere in the comfortable middle. She had declined the exit ramp. There was no middle. She had been groped, she had said so, and the question of whether she had smiled in a photograph 30 seconds later was not a contradiction. It was what women do when they are backstage at their own concert and a man's hand has just made them a statistic. Her mother, Andrea Swift, sat in the courtroom gallery throughout the proceedings. Andrea had been present at the original incident, had been the first person Taylor told, had watched the whole 4-year sequence from the inside. Their relationship, which had always carried something of the quality of a professional and personal alliance, as much as a maternal bond, had been reshaped by the years of Taylor's adult autonomy into something more explicitly collaborative. Andrea managed the family's philanthropic instincts, coordinated the long arc decisions about which battles to fight and which to absorb quietly. That she was present in Denver every day was not ceremonial. Andrea Swift, who would 2 years later be diagnosed with cancer for the second time, understood better than anyone that certain battles have to be fought in the body, in public, in the language of institutions, and that her daughter had always possessed the particular constitution required to fight them that way. The jury deliberated for a little over 3 hours. They found in favor of Swift on all counts. Mueller's lawsuit was dismissed. Swift's counterclaim prevailed. The awarded damages were $1, precisely as requested. She released a statement the same afternoon. It was not long. I acknowledge the privilege that I benefit from in life, in society, and in my ability to shoulder the enormous cost of defending myself in a trial like this, she wrote. My hope is to help those whose voices should also be heard. Therefore, I will be making donations in the near future to organizations which support sexual assault victims in their fight to be heard. She did not name a figure for the donations. She did not need to. The statement's grammar was its meaning. The trial had not been at its core about her. It had been a proving ground, a stress test of the proposition that a woman could say what happened, hold to it without ornamentation, and be believed by 12 strangers in a room. In the weeks following the verdict, the donations arrived quietly at organizations across the country. Joyful Heart Foundation, which supported survivors of sexual assault. RAINN, the Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network. Dozens of individuals reached out through her management to describe their own experiences, their own pending cases, their own calculations about whether speaking would cost more than it gained. Her team directed resources where they could, without press releases, without a named campaign architecture. The advocacy operated in the mode that her most significant actions so often did, structurally rather than symbolically, through systems rather than statements, with the long view in mind over the immediate headline. What the trial had exposed, in the same way that a pressurized system exposes cracks invisible under ordinary conditions, was the specific gravity of her public credibility as a tool. She had spent years being described, alternately and sometimes simultaneously, as calculating and naive, as a victim and a manipulator, as someone who manufactured her own controversies, and someone who was perpetually wounded by them. The Kim Kardashian phone call recording had been released the summer before, and the subsequent months had been defined by a public retreat so complete that it had felt, to many observers, like an erasure. She had gone quiet. She had worked. And then she had walked into a federal courthouse in Denver and sat across from a team of attorneys and said in plain language that required no metaphor, "This happened. I told the truth and I am still here." The verdict was handed down on August 14, 2017. 8 weeks later, the Weinstein story broke. The hashtag followed shortly after. And the trial in Denver, which had unfolded in relative real time and been reported with the compressed attention cycle of the modern news environment, was suddenly resituated, not as a celebrity legal dispute, but as a precursor document to a larger reckoning, evidence that the tools existed if the will to use them could be summoned. Taylor Swift did not claim credit for the reckoning. She did not position herself at the center of the cultural moment. She had done what she came to Denver to do, collected her dollar, and gone back to work on the album that she had been building in silence for most of the year. An album that would abandon the pristine architectural pop of 1989 entirely, that would occupy a darker and more vengeful register, that would settle accounts she had kept in her own ledger since the first time she had been told her anger was unattractive. The trial had clarified something for her about the relationship between what she knew to be true and what she was willing to say in public. The distance between those two things, she had decided, was no longer a distance she was interested in maintaining. What she could not yet know, as she returned to the studio and the album that would become Reputation, was that the clarity she had found in a Denver courtroom, the refusal of the false middle, the insistence on precise language, the willingness to be the only one in the room telling an inconvenient truth, would be tested again, almost immediately, in a domain she had not anticipated, by a force that did not operate through legal filings or cross-examination, but through something older and harder to contest, the machinery of public opinion itself, which had already decided what kind of woman she was and was not yet finished with her. Chapter 50. The Disappearance, Deleting the Digital Self. The cursor hovered. It was the kind of pause that exists only in the space between a decision and its consequences, the held breath before the dive, the silence before the door swings open onto something entirely new. The screen's blue light fell across the room, in the particular way screens do at 2 or 3 in the morning, when the rest of the world has receded, and the only thing that remains is the luminous rectangle demanding that you choose. There were no publicists in the room now. No managers, no brand consultants, no handlers positioned at respectful distances with soft voices and careful suggestions. Whatever was about to happen would happen in the clean solitude of intention. And then the feeds went dark, one account, then another, until the digital footprint of the most omnipresent musical figure of the early 21st century had been reduced, in the span of a single night in August 2017, to an absolute and deliberate nothing. She had built that presence brick by brick, year by year, with a curator's patience and a strategist's discipline. To understand the weight of what she erased, you have to understand what she had assembled. By the summer of 2017, Taylor Swift's social media architecture was among the most sophisticated personal brand structures ever constructed by an individual in the entertainment industry. Her Twitter account carried over 85 million followers. Her Instagram had become something closer to an art form than a feed. A carefully maintained gallery of selective revelation, images chosen to suggest intimacy while remaining hermetically controlled, a simulation of access rather than access itself. She had understood before almost anyone else in the music industry that the parasocial bond could be engineered, that the feeling of knowing someone was itself a product that could be manufactured and distributed at scale. She had done it extraordinarily well. And then, on a Tuesday that offered no warning and no explanation, she wiped the canvas entirely. The digital void lasted for roughly a week before the snake arrived. In the weeks immediately preceding the erasure, the cultural temperature around Taylor Swift had reached a particular kind of fever. Not the feverish adoration that had defined her ascendance, but something courtier and more complex, a mixture of mockery and grievance and fatigue that had crystallized across social media into something approaching a collective verdict. The summer of 2016 had been punishing. The protracted public conflict with Kanye West and Kim Kardashian over the content of a phone call, whether Swift had approved the lyric in Famous that referred to her in terms she found degrading, had become, in the accelerated moral economy of the Internet, a settled matter before it was even fairly examined. When Kardashian released a series of video clips in July 2016, presenting what appeared to be recorded evidence of Swift's prior knowledge, the response across social media was swift and overwhelming. The hashtag #TaylorSwiftIsOverParty trended globally. The snake emoji proliferated across her Instagram comments in the hundreds of thousands, a symbol adopted by detractors to characterize her as calculating, duplicitous, fake. The charges had a particular sting because they engaged so directly with the architecture of her public self. The accusation was not merely that she had lied about this specific incident, it was that the entire construction, the relatability, the warmth, the sense of guileless authenticity she had spent a decade cultivating, was itself a performance, a sophisticated lie. She was called, across thousands of articles, and tens of millions of social media posts, a snake, a manipulator, a master of playing victim. The narrative cohered with frightening speed. By the end of 2016, Swift had, by many cultural measures, fallen from the apex of pop's moral hierarchy to something considerably more complicated. She did not respond to this publicly. That silence, too, was read as guilt, as retreat, as further calculation. There was no position she could take that would not be absorbed by the discourse and turned against her. She had encountered the central paradox of extreme cultural visibility at the precise moment when social media had become a mechanism not for amplification, but for trial. The more famous you were, the larger the target you offered, and the more you had previously cultivated an image of flawlessness, the more satisfying the collapse. The core conflict she faced in this period was not the specific allegation. The specific allegation was, in the long view, mundane, a dispute about creative credit, filtered through the chaotic acoustics of celebrity culture. The deeper conflict was ontological. She had built a self in public, assembled it carefully over 15 years from the material of her Tennessee childhood and her Nashville apprenticeship and her global stardom, and now that self had been determined, by consensus, by meme, by the aggregate judgment of millions, to be fraudulent. The question confronting her was not how to respond to the snake emoji. The question was what to do when the identity you have spent your adult life constructing has been, in the court of public opinion, successfully contested. Do you defend it? Do you modify it? Or do you let it die? She chose death. The decision to wipe her social media was, on its surface, a tactic. It cleared the ground for the rollout of a new album, what would eventually arrive as Reputation, released in November 2017, an album that took the snake iconography deployed against her and inverted it, wore it as armor, made it a central element of the visual identity of the project. The erasure was, in this reading, the opening move of a counter-narrative campaign, a way of generating mystique and attention before a major commercial release. This reading is accurate. It is also incomplete. What made the deletion more than strategy was the particular completeness of it. Not merely the removal of recent content, but the removal of everything, the entire archive, years of posts and photographs and captions and announcements, the accumulated digital residue of a public life lived at extraordinary volume. Most artists who briefly retreated from social media left the past in place, taking a break rather than committing an erasure. She performed something closer to a controlled demolition. The implication was not, I need a break. The implication was, the person you thought you knew no longer exists, and I have removed the evidence of her so that you cannot use her against me anymore. It was a move that required a fundamental reckoning with what she had built and what it had cost her. In conversation years later, she would describe this period in terms that gesture towards something more profound than brand recalibration. A confrontation with the degree to which she had sacrificed authentic interiority to the project of public construction, the extent to which she had lived not as a private self who occasionally appeared in public, but as a public self who had forgotten, somewhere in the years of stadiums and magazine covers and Grammy speeches, that there had once been a private one. The erasure was the first legible signal that she was no longer willing to perform recovery in real time, to let the public audience sit in the front row of her processing, as they had during the Red Era and the early 1989 era. She was going somewhere they could not follow. The relationship that most acutely measured the dimensions of this transformation was, in some ways, the one she had with her own fan base, the group that called itself Swifties, whose loyalty had been one of the defining constants of her career. Throughout the 1989 era and the years immediately preceding the erasure, she had cultivated an almost unprecedented intimacy with this audience, hosting fans at her homes for listening sessions, leaving cryptic clues across social media that invited close reading, creating what she called secret sessions designed to make followers feel singularly seen. The relationship was genuinely unusual in the landscape of contemporary celebrity. A sustained, deliberate attempt to close the distance between star and devotee in ways that felt emotionally real, at least from one side. The erasure ended that contract without announcement. There was no farewell post, no explanation offered to the millions who had built their parasocial attachment on the premise that she would always tell them in some register what was happening. The silence was absolute. For a portion of her fan base, this produced something close to grief, the specific disorientation of finding that a relationship you had understood to be open had been, without warning, closed. For others, the silence read as signal. She was trusting them to follow her across a void, to wait on the other side of the darkness for whatever came next. That act of trust, or its simulation, was itself a form of intimacy, a different kind than the curated access of the 1989 era, but no less engineered. What the erasure marked, in its largest sense, was the end of the chapter that 1989 had opened. That album, released in October 2014, had been the document of her New York translation, the record of a woman stepping out of the country music framework that had shaped her first decade and declaring herself, without apology, a creature of pure pop ambition, of penthouse parties and fashion week front rows and the kind of metropolitan cool she had consciously moved to Manhattan to absorb. The songs were crystalline and propulsive and almost brutally contained, each one a precision instrument calibrated to maximum emotional yield. It had worked beyond any reasonable projection. 1989 became the best-selling album of 2014, won the Grammy for Album of the Year in 2016, spawned a tour that became the highest grossing of that year, and installed her in a cultural moment still responsive to such installations as the unambiguous sovereign of mainstream pop. The city itself had been both backdrop and instrument. She had moved to New York in 2014 with the self-consciousness of someone who understood that geography shapes narrative, that where you lived told a story about who you were becoming. She was photographed in the Village, at coffee shops in Tribeca, at basketball games at Madison Square Garden, at industry parties in spaces that announced their own distinction. She assembled around herself what the tabloids came to call a squad, a rotating coalition of models, actresses, and musicians whose combined cultural visibility amplified her own. The squad became its own story, inseparable from the 1989 moment. A visual argument about female friendship and collective power that generated enormous amounts of press and eventually its own critique, that the friendships were curated, that the diversity of the group was calculated, that what looked like genuine warmth was, on closer examination, another product. That critique, arriving alongside the Kanye Kardashian narrative, formed the compound charge to which the erasure was the response. By August 2017, the 1989 version of Taylor Swift, the optimistic, penthouse-dwelling, squad-assembling, Grammy-winning, benevolent sovereign of pop, had been systematically contested. The city she had claimed as her adopted home had watched the image crack. The digital empire she had built to sustain that image had been repurposed by her detractors as a platform for humiliation. She could not repair the image because the image itself was the problem. She could only remove it. The screen went dark. The accounts showed 0 posts, 0 followers, 0 following. In the absence of everything she had constructed, there was a silence so complete it had its own weight, the particular gravity of a cleared field, of ground prepared for something that has not yet been named but is already, somewhere in the interior distances where such things beginning. What no one who watched the feeds go dark could know then was that the silence was not an ending. It was an instruction. To look away, to stop looking, to lose interest in the person who had occupied that space, because what was coming required darkness to take its full shape, and the thing taking shape in the quiet was considerably more volatile than anything the old version had been willing to show. The snake, it turned out, had been patient for a reason.